We're going to have this conversation, however long it lasts, so we're going to see if there's any tools we can take from this, anything interesting that can be useful as a tool in our lives to help us, very minimum, lessen our neuroses and grow our goodness, bare minimum, so that we can be of use to others on this earth, because we all live in this crazy world together. Something like that it expresses, okay. Sangye chodam soke chognam la jancho baru dagni kyab suchi dagi chonyen gi personam ki drola penchir sangye.
We're here to have a conversation today on Are You OK Day about depression, fear and anxiety and how you can be your own therapist. Robina is an Australian, ex-Catholic, ex-radical political activist and feminist Buddhist nun. Her life and work has been featured in 2 documentary films, one of which, called Chasing Buddha, we screened here at Melbourne Uni last year, and we were fortunate enough to have the director come and speak to us, Melbourne Courtin. And we're even luckier today to have Robina herself. Robina founded the Liberation Prison Project in 1997, which is a project that worked in America.
Australia too.
Oh, and Australia as well. So working with prison inmates, teaching them Buddhism and working on their Buddhist studies. She was ordained as a Buddhist nun in 1977. She was the editor and director of Wisdom Publications until 1987, and she was also the editor and director of international Buddhist magazine Mandala until the end of 2000. She's appeared on Q&A, on Judith Lucy's show The Spiritual Journey, and recently on ABC's Book Club. Her teaching style is about bringing Tibetan Buddhism into contemporary life, and she has quite a unique style and approach to Buddhist psychology and philosophy. She cuts through the meek and mild stereotype and gets straight to the heart of the issue, I think. So
it's called rude.
So without any further ado, we'll just get straight to the point and I have a few questions to start the conversation. So my first question is that why do you think it is that so many of us struggle with these problems of depression, fear and anxiety?
Well, I mean, I'm sitting here being a Buddhist nun, so I've got to give you the Buddhist approach, which is the view, the worldview that I'm using in my life, basically, for interpreting my life. This is because Buddhism actually is a worldview, if you look at it from the big picture point of view, and the traditions I come from, the Tibetan tradition from the great monastic university system, where they study the full Buddhist view of the universe, which really means a Buddhist philosophical approach as well as psychological. Because actually, Buddha's main expertise is the mind, and I think this is not often evident to anybody, because as soon as we hear the word monk or hear a prayer, we think religion, and then we don't think psychology. But actually, Buddhism, which came, and I'm getting to your answer, I'm just going to do a tiny bit of background, okay? But the Buddhist view of the mind has come out of the Hindu view, because Hindus, even though they've got this religious thing, they're the ones who actually probably 3,000 years ago who started this really incredible investigation into the nature of self, which is the main interest of the Hindus, and then Buddha came out of that. And then, diverging in some various ways in his interpretations. But essentially, the Buddhist view is about the mind. He doesn't use the word soul, doesn't use the word spirit, So even though, for us in the world now, since, say, our own Western Christian Jewish view of coming from the Middle Ages, well, certainly the Christian one, where there was religion, and then gradually with the scientists developing out of this, is now this complete separation, isn't it? There's religion, there's this weird stuff that you believe in and doesn't have any logical basis, and then you have this really logical thing called science. Well, kind of interestingly, the approach in Buddhism is actually like the scientific one. It's a surprise to us, because when you talk about reincarnation and things that you can't see with your eyes, we assume they can't be proven. But if we take the Buddhist view of the mind, which is that it's not physical, it doesn't come from creators, it doesn't come from parents, and it's got its own continuity of mental moments that goes back and back and will continue on and on. So the way I'm saying it is for myself, that I take it as my hypothesis, as my working hypothesis, for, as I said, for interpreting my life, my world, and the world around me. So taking this view of the mind, the Buddha's own view, and because he's not a creator, this is the crucial point, he was a regular guy who became what they call a Buddha, which is a person who's fully developed the goodness within us, speaking very simply, and absolutely eradicated all the neuroses. So one of Buddha's fundamental findings from his own direct experience, and this is the point, it's not a belief system in that sense. I was brought up a Catholic, And I was taught that God is my creator, that God is, the core, therefore God is the creator of the laws of morality, God is to be obeyed, and therefore God is to be believed in. It would be considered really kind of bad manners and rather rude to stick your nose into God's view and see if he's right or wrong. But the Buddhist approach, because he doesn't assert a creator, he would say we don't need creating. All his views there explain where we come from and so on and so forth. But the Buddhist approach is that given that he was a regular guy who found from his own direct experience things that we would call Buddhism, his own findings about the world, about the universe, about happiness, about suffering, about what beings are, what mind is, and what our potential is, then a person who's actually being a Buddhist, I never use the word I believe in Buddhism. It just often can be intellectually lazy, It's easy to believe in anything you like. But the approach in the Buddhist one is you take it actually literally like you would as any decent scientific approach. You take it as your working hypothesis and then you engage in it. And as the Dalai Lama often points out when he's teaching in the West, if you take on board Buddha's view and you try it each step of the way, and at some point you actually don't get the result that he said, then you must reject the Buddha. This is very much the approach. So the Buddha's view about mind, his fundamental finding is that every single mind, and the word in Tibetan for a sentient being, or a person really, is the word mind possessor. So every mind, and that would include other beings besides humans, but never mind that here, but every single one of us, by definition, having a mind, every mind necessarily possesses the potential to be utterly free of all the rubbish, all the neuroses, all the misery, all the fears, all the ego, all the depression, all the anxiety, these words we all know so well, that they're not at the core of our being. The Buddha's own finding is that this stuff is adventitious. I mean, it's not a word I use in my daily life. You look in your dictionary and it will tell you that that adventitious is that it's not actually at the core. It's not central. It's not fundamental to our being. It's actually, therefore, can be removed. So psychologically speaking, this is kind of shocking. I mean, if one of you is a therapist and I go ask you for methods to please help me get rid of all ego, all fear, all attachment, all jealousy, all low self-esteem, all depression, and develop love and compassion for all beings perfectly, you will definitely think I'm a bit of a psycho. Quite seriously, because there's no view like that in any of our findings, are there? In our own views of our own models of the mind in the contemporary world. But this is the point. This is Buddha's finding. This is the meaning of this word nirvana. It's not some place like heaven, believe me. Buddha does assert different levels of reality, there's no question. But nirvana really very simply speaking, is a word you can use to refer to the mind of the person who's done the job, following Buddha's own methods that he used, that brought him to his own results, of ridding the mind of all the neuroses and fully developing all the goodness in us. So when you study Buddhist psychology in depth, you go into great depth into these and explaining all the logic of it. So then, getting to the... So the way the Buddha talks about the mind, the Buddhist model of the mind, it's not complicated, actually, it seems rather simplistic. He would say in our mental consciousness, we can divide the contents of our mind into three categories: positive, negative, and neutral. Now, these are not moralistic titles, these are technical terms for the contents of our mind, And so, remember, the mind for the Buddha is not physical. Second, and a really crucial point, is that your mind, is not the mere conceptuality and sensory experiences that we all would posit as our mind. We know we have dreams, but I think there's no agreement about what dreams are. They're really a peculiar kind of place, isn't it? But so the grosser level of mind, using the Buddha's view, is just the tip of the iceberg, the conceptual and the sensory. This is the tip of the iceberg of our mind, our capacity for cognition, which is what the mind's job is. So then the Buddha would assert subtler levels of mind. And this is coming out of these amazing psychological techniques that came out of the Hindu tradition, like I mentioned, called, the techniques that are often we refer to as meditation, and even more generally as mindfulness meditation, or known better precisely as concentration meditation. These amazing techniques, which the Hindus came up with in their investigation of the nature of self and what a person is, enables a person to go way beyond the grosser level of our mind, which we don't even posit as existing in our materialist views, So the mind at subtler levels, the Buddha's view is, his own findings, coming again from the Hindu one, is that we can access these subtler levels of our mind in the long term. This is these concentration meditation techniques that are really intense, disciplined, rigorous psychological techniques. They're not mystical, do not mystify them, that enable us to go to these subtler levels, and then based on the understanding of Buddhist psychology, therefore based on the understanding of your own mind, the contents of your own mind, we can gradually lessen and eventually rid our mind completely of all these neurotic states. And then fully develop, on the other hand, all the positive ones. I mean, it sounds kind of simple and cute in a way, negative, positive, you know. But the Buddhist psychological view is very precise, in great detail, describing the characteristics of the negative ones, which I now want to talk about to get to the actual answer, okay? So again, remember when we talk about the mind in Buddhism, we're not discussing a brain. You ask anybody who's living up in the mountains, doing their meditations, doing this job that Buddha has laid out in order to achieve their own liberation from suffering and its causes, then you ask them where their brain is, they would not have a clue. You know, and I'm not being rude about all the amazing things we're doing in the West. It's incredible. These marvelous, especially the last 20, 30 years, I think, these amazing discussions between all the best brains in the West and some of the best Tibetan Buddhist brains, including the Dalai Lama. These conferences run by an organization called Mind and Life, and I think they've mostly been published. Some of the amazing findings these days, like for example neuroplasticity, have come out of, I think a lot of it has come out of the experiments on the brains of meditators. You know, and so all this is doing, from my perspective, being a Buddhist, is reaffirming Buddha's own findings about mind, that the neuroses in our mind are adventitious, that they're not at the core of our being, and the point of all the Buddha's path is to rid the mind of these. Because they're why? Because they're the cause of suffering. So getting to the point, they're the cause of suffering. So why do we all have them? Well, join the club, people. This is called, Buddha calls it samsara. We just call it, you know, daily life. Samsara is a word that refers to being caught up in all these neuroses. So in the Buddhist model, there's a very clear description of these states of mind. If we look at the negative states, there's like a hierarchy of these negative states of mind. So the root one, okay, the two main terms they use in Buddhist psychology to refer to the neuroses, I'd call them neuroses, and that's a nice word, you know. They're extremely disturbing. So check the last time you were jealous, depressed, angry, you know, had low self-esteem, resentful. I think we can all agree we were deeply disturbed. Forget about the people we disturb on the basis of it, but it's very evident that when we're caught up to whatever extent in those unhappy states, which we in our models of the mind completely consider to be totally normal, you know, and they are normal insofar as we've all got them, but basically the Buddha says we're mentally ill, you know. His view of mental illness, I think he would have liked that term, is far more radical than our view. I mean, it seems to me in our world, if you have a very extremely disturbing, you know, a state of mind all the time, then you're considered mentally ill. But a daily fit of anger or jealousy, you're just considered normal, you know. But the Buddha would say having any of these, because his own finding is that they're adventitious, having any of them at all is a state of deep disturbance, you know.
I think the Dalai Lama said something about that he felt that in the West, that a lack of self-esteem was like what you said, it was a sickness that he thought was more prominent in the West.
That's right.
And I was wondering with what
it's coming
you're
to the
saying,
same answer.
Yeah.
I'll cover
do
it.
you think that that is true?
I will. I'll cover it for
great.
you. In this hierarchy of these states of mind, the root one, they call another term. There's two main terms, disturbing emotion, and the other one, which is really interesting because it really gets into understanding the Buddha's view of the mind, this is termed delusion. And this is quite shocking actually, because I think if you were accused of being delusional, I think you'd be feeling quite offended. But this is the exact point, and this understanding this gets us to understand Buddha's approach, you know, to the way the mind works and why we therefore suffer. And so the root of these delusions, it's actually the way we cling to a really mistaken sense of self. And this is getting right us back to the basics of where Buddha's coming from, investigating what the self is, what is a person, what is an I, what is itself, how do we function, you know? So the Buddha would say that we've got this deeply instinctive, primordially held misconception about our own sense of self. So that on the basis of this main delusion in day-to-day life is called attachment, which is basically this huge bottomless pit of desperate neediness every millisecond to get what this sense of self wants. And then on the basis of that attachment not getting what it wants, that's what anger is. So in the most simple way, if we look at the Buddhist view, we're running between attachment and anger about 1,000 times a day. And the energy of attachment, which is so subtle, it works at grosser levels, like attachment to cake, attachment to sex. It's an over-exaggeration of the delicious qualities of something such that we feel that when I get it, I'll get happy. And this is what Buddha, you know, would say is the main day-to-day delusion that runs the show, that runs every sentient being. For us in our world, we would consider it totally normal. So to even listen to the way he's talking about it and try and observe how it's a neurosis is not an easy job, because just for us, it's totally normal life to have all this neediness, to want this, want that. And its real energy, and this is getting to the one of low self-esteem, it's the energy of this attachment is actually dissatisfaction. So in other words, this primordial feeling that somehow, no matter what I do, no matter what I get, no matter what I have, it's never enough. It's never enough. Always a sense of dissatisfaction. And that, if you look at it very strongly, is exactly what low self-esteem is. Always finding fault, always criticising ourselves, which means never satisfied with what we've achieved or what we've got, always wanting something more. Bottomless pit, you know. And I think that is a more prevalent state of mind in a world like ours. I mean, if we compare our world with Tibet, 60 years ago, before the communist Chinese came along, it was medieval, basically. I mean, the only colour and life and joy, in a way, well, that's not true, but the colour and energy and interesting things was in the monastic universities. I mean, 90% of them were, a sixth of the population were in the great monastic universities studying, were all the, like medieval times, in our times, That's where the poetry and the grammar and all the exciting things were, and the art and the music. Ordinary lay life was kind of fundamental, pretty basic. So when you've got a world like ours, where we can just, by clicking our fingers, get anything that we want, which is the energy of attachment that's created it, the more you get, my mother used to say, the more you get, the more you want. And this is the Buddhist approach to attachment. It's a bottomless pit. So this is very much the basis of why we never satisfied. And of course, the thing we're not satisfied with mostly is ourself, Why we're like this, Buddha says, because it's normal human behaviour, join the club, because we have attachment and anger and all the rest.
And so how do we break through that? How do we become our own therapist, as you put it?
Well, by saying what I said, the methods were implied, weren't they?
What would be some practical steps, like as in meditation, or how do I look within myself? How do I deal with that? What would be some tools?
I understand. I've just given an overview of the Buddhist view, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And he's saying that the neuroses are in here.
Yes.
And he's saying that you've got an ability to meditate, to get concentration.
Yes.
So doesn't that imply that that's the technique that you have to get? So you need two tools.
Yes.
Well, the first one I would say, is to consider the possibility that you can change your thoughts. This has to be the first one. I mean, in the West we say change your brain. That's okay, I'm happy to say that. But the point is to change your thoughts, isn't it? Because all these, what we would call emotions, I think this is what's hard to see initially, there's attachment and anger and jealousy that seems so primordial, as we would call them emotions, right? Feelings, isn't it? But actually the Buddhist view is that's the tip of the iceberg, surprisingly. We only really notice what we think and feel, isn't it? When it vomits out the mouth, or when you can't get out of bed one morning because you're so depressed. Oh, I must be depressed. So we only really notice what's going on inside here, because it's not really part of our culture to look inside. We don't have really skillful introspective techniques. From the second we wake up in the morning, and all of our expertise in our materialist modern world is external. Even when we talk about the mind, it's about looking at the brain, isn't it? Not looking internally. And if you go to a therapist, you're considered mentally ill and you feel embarrassed to say it.
That's right.
So it's because that's our culture, that's the world, that's our model, isn't it? It's the external scientific model. But I think because religion has a dirty name, isn't it? Science is more important. We put our serious hat on when it's called science. We put our weird hat on when it's called religion, isn't it? And because looking inside is kind of considered a bit religious, isn't it? So I think it's just the prevalence in our culture, isn't it? That there's not much respect anymore, perhaps, paid to spiritual techniques. And then I think part of the problem, Dana, is that we think spiritual is not, and this can't be proven. I think this is a major point. We think science can be proven, but as soon as you talk religion, that's a belief system. I think that's a really crucial point that we have to get past, and that's the Buddhist one, that if you can't prove it, it doesn't exist. By definition, if you can't prove it, it doesn't exist. If you can't learn from your own direct experience to actually cognize it directly, it doesn't exist. Because for the Buddha, mind is absolutely central. So it's not part of our culture to look inside, but if we respected it, of course, then we would use these techniques, wouldn't we? What's your name?
I'm Alistair.
Alistair. Where does this mode exist? Where are you suggesting it exists?
When you discuss it, you say everybody in humanity is, or the greatest degree is stuck in attachment and neuroses. And that there's another state of play there. That would be...
No, it's just potential in our mind. Alistair might have attachment and jealousy and anger, and all Buddha's suggestion is, from his own findings, is by you working on your mind, you can lessen that and eventually get rid of it and grow the other part of yourself. So the state of play is in your own mind.
Okay.
The possibility is there.
How did that state of negative play come into play?
It didn't.
Okay.
It can't. There can't be a first moment. We all want a first moment, I think. But the Buddha would say, he says, we look at the world, I think the law of cause and effect would apply. You know, you do this and this and this and you get that. And once you've proven it, you're going to get that every time. The law, once we know what a law is, it works every time, doesn't it? Well, the Buddha would talk about the law of karma, which is what plays out in minds. Whatever minds do, and there's all these detailed explanations of all this, what minds do will bring results. And so everything that exists is a product of the law of cause and effect. So speaking even most simply, if you have a law of cause and effect, you can't possibly have a first cause, which would imply a thing that didn't have a cause. So the Buddha's view, as mad as it sounds to all us, and mad as insane as it sounds, is that minds are beginningless and matter is also beginningless. This is why Buddha's whole view doesn't assert a creator, you know. I mean, just speaking simply, there can't be a first moment, which sounds pretty demented. Our strongest emotion is to think there's a first moment. They study this for 30 years in the monastic universities and then they go meditate for another 30, okay, so.
If that glorification of being busy is, it comes along with the presumption that being busy is going to make us happy, but in actual fact it kind of denies us the space to go within.
Sure, I think that's probably very true, yeah. Well, putting it another way, and this is the Buddhist way of saying it too, is, using that as an example, they talk about 3 levels of laziness. The first one is can't be bothered, you know, can't be bothered, isn't it?
Yeah.
Too much effort.
Yeah.
The second one is I'm too busy. Called procrastination. So we look at our own lives, forget spiritual practice, but what's the thing you procrastinate doing? The thing you have to make effort to do, the thing that you're not good at doing. So therefore, really, we can say our attachment, which is this junkie within us that just wants to take the easy road. We run to the jobs we prefer to do. We run to the jobs we're familiar with. So to make effort to do anything that you haven't done before, I mean, to do what you haven't done before takes enormous effort, doesn't it? You've got to stretch yourself. So that takes real confidence, and you have to want to make a strong decision to do it, and you've got to see the benefits of why you want to do it. And it's not evident to us the benefits of sitting there watching your boring old breath, or looking at your mind, or controlling your anger. There's no immediate benefit
There's
whatsoever.
no external validation from it.
There's no internal benefit. You can't feel any benefit. It just feels like too much work, you know. I'd rather dump onto somebody else and blame, and you understand. So it's not an easy job for us to look inside, because it demands enormous accountability. It demands you see your own mind world, you take responsibility for it, you stop blaming others, and that's a massive thing to do, which takes time, you know. And having this confidence that you're not stuck with what's inside there. And if we look at the way ego works, you know, when you're really depressed, or when you're really angry, or when you're really jealous, nothing in the universe can convince you that it's not going to last forever. There's a very powerful feeling that this is the status quo, and you can't see the light at the end of the tunnel. And then when we get all this guilt and shame about our rubbish, we really believe it's at the core of our being. And so to be able to see some benefit, we'd love to be able to get rid of it, but it takes enormous effort and work to do that, and some kind of conviction, logical conviction that it's possible.
Do you also think that it feels overwhelming, because when you're in that kind of mental state, it feels like a very isolated and personal experience to you?
It is, totally, yeah, that's right.
But in actual fact, when we start to kind of share our stories about our suffering,
share our stories.
Yeah, like just talk about the reality of what we're experiencing internally to other people.
Thank you. Okay, people who want to listen, I hope.
Yeah, hopefully people who want to listen.
Yes.
Is that I think we can pick up universal themes. So what I'm wondering is, do you think that we're often more alike than we are different, even though we feel like my suffering is unique?
Oh, totally. Oh my God. I mean, speaking in the long term, okay, not trying to sound cosmic, but speaking in the long term from Buddha's explanations of what we're capable of achieving, that eventually when you've rid the mind of the neuroses, there is no longer a sense of separateness from others. What Buddha's saying is that words like love, compassion, and don't be cosmic about it, please. We all recognise these words because we've got this stuff inside us. But all the states of mind that we know we all have, that we know are necessarily connected to others, isn't it? When you have love and compassion and empathy, it's related necessarily to other beings, isn't it? Not to, you know, to rocks and tables. It's to other sentient beings. So there's a sense of connectedness, wouldn't you agree? Yeah. A sense of expansion. But when you have attachment and anger and jealousy, you're completely isolated in your own misery. And that's what Buddha's saying is the irony of ego is totally self-centered. Not being mean, don't be guilty about it. It's the nature of it. We're completely caught up in our own utter misery, can't see past our own nose. So as soon as we can go beyond that, then eventually this goodness, Buddha says, is what is at the core of our being. It's indestructible. It is at the core of our being. And as and when we lessen the neuroses from hard work, and you're necessarily growing the other part of you, which means empathy and connectedness with others, which also means joy and all the other words, you know.
Do you think that there are distinct differences between the sexes, Or
No. Finally, there aren't. Mind is mind. Mind is not male or female.
So do you think that it's like Cordelia Fine, who's a neuroscience, a neuroscientist, says that gender is a delusion? Would you agree?
Yeah, I'd say so for sure. It's just, I mean, it's cultural, isn't it? But the Buddhist view is, if we take Buddha's view that my consciousness and Alistair's consciousness are beginningless continuities and mental moments that go back to beginningless time, as mad as it sounds, the Buddha would also say we've had male bodies and female bodies and dog bodies and ant bodies countless times, different levels of mind. So mind itself is not innately male or female or anything, but it's such a powerful way we identify. I remember teaching in a prison on the East Coast in the States one time, and most of the people in the prison at that time who came to the class were black. So we were discussing the whole concept of karma and reincarnation, Buddha's view, right? How you can be born different lives. And one of them, he was kind of gobsmacked and said, "Do you mean I can be born a white man?" It was really powerful because you identify very powerfully, especially, in that country, or let's say any country where racism is strong. But I didn't tell him he could be born a white woman, because the gender one is so powerful for us. I think it is. It's so we really identify. And then I used to do my research among people in prison and ask them, how do you, and I would have thought they'd all say race. Everyone said they identify more strongly with gender than race. And even on the East Coast and the States where racism is so rampant, I was very surprised. Okay, this gets us really to the whole Buddhist approach of how we define self. Because each one of us in this room, we've all got a sense of a self, and then we obviously have built up, haven't we, over our lives, either from external feedback and from our own internal kind of processes, a very strong sense of who we are, if we had to write it all down, we'd define it in terms of who we are, our race, our shortness, our fatness, our thinness, our intelligence, our beauty, our ugliness, all the attributes. And gender is, of course, it's a major part. I mean, it's a massive, massive way we divide the world, isn't it? It's a true, relatively speaking, it's true. Like relatively, you're a carpenter. Relatively, you're black. But the Buddha's key point about self, fundamentally, they are relatively true, but they're not at the core of our being. They're not at the core of our being, So all of these, whether you call yourself a male or a carpenter, they're both delusions, if you like. They're both attributes that we do take on, but we give more power to. And that's a key way of talking where Buddha says we over-exaggerate. The way ego and all the delusions function, they over-exaggerate the characteristics of these different attributes that we define ourselves by and identify with,
Can you define delusions for us?
Yeah, very clearly for the Buddha. A delusion and disturbing emotion, remember I said, are two of the key terms referring to these neuroses that he says are adventitious, such that when you've realised emptiness, seen the nature of reality, rid the mind of all the rubbish, you've fully developed all the goodness and you rid your mind of all this stuff. So delusion literally means, as we know, you're delusional when you're not in touch with reality. So quite literally, this ego grasping, this colloquial term that Buddha would refer to as this deep grasping at the sense of self, ego grasping, which gives rise to the delusion called attachment, which runs us in day-to-day life, which is this neediness to get what I want every second, which then gives rise to anger and panic attacks and guilt and depression when it doesn't get what it wants, which then gives rise to jealousy and all the other variations. They all share this two characteristics of being deeply disturbing, which we can see pretty quickly from our own experience. But the other one is, and this is what's hard to see, is that they are delusional states of mind. And that gets us to have to understand in the Buddhist model that these emotions, we call them emotions, once we start to learn to meditate and focus the mind in a very rigorous way, and once we take on board Buddha's model, which we use as our basis for interpreting what we're seeing in our focus, with our focused mind, we're going to start to go beyond the emotional component. And this only takes a while to get to this. You get beyond the emotional component, the feeling component, the energy, and you get to begin to hear the elaborate stories. They're all conceptual stories. They're elaborate conceptual stories. And when you can hear those, they're exaggerations. So attachment exaggerates the deliciousness of a cake. Anger exaggerates the ugliness of that person. What does depression exaggerate? The ugliness of me, isn't it? They're all necessarily exaggerations, and that's how they're delusional, literally. They're not assessments of truth. And this is Buddha's key point. From the wisdom teachings perspective in Buddhism, you can take it from the perspective of morality or the wisdom perspective. All these neuroses are actually conceptual states of mind, but deeply ingrained. The Buddha would say we come fully programmed at an instinctive level with all these sense of self and all the dramas from the time of conception in our mother's womb, which we brought with us from before. The West would say we bring them from our mummy and daddy genes, but the Buddha would say we bring them from our own past habits. And so they're deeply ingrained. to the point where they feel instinctive to us. But you unpack them, and this is what you need these meditation techniques for. When you begin to unpack and unravel and deconstruct them, we're going to see there are elaborate conceptual dramas, stories that are complete distorted exaggerations of reality.
So if the concept of gender is a delusion as well, then I'm curious to know, can you be a feminist and a Buddhist?
I was a Catholic first, then I blamed all the Catholic people, all the non-Catholics, and then I became a kind of hippie and I blamed all the straight people. And then I became a communist and a radical lefty, and I blamed all the rich people. Then I became into black politics at the time of the Black Panthers and all that in the 60s and 70s. And then I heard about feminism, and I didn't even know the word. I heard the word feminist. And then I heard, radical. I thought, I like radical, So then I became a radical feminist. And then, of course, naturally, I always took every philosophy very seriously, whatever I did. So then I eventually chucked out men. First I chucked out God and I preferred boys, and then I chucked out men and became a radical lesbian feminist. Then I even became a radical lesbian separatist feminist. So it was that for me was being a feminist then. Yeah. But then I realised I couldn't hate most of the human race. It was kind of exhausting. I had no one left to blame. So that's when I bumped into these Buddhists, and they suggested I should look at myself, which is a brand new idea, Anyway, of course you can be a feminist. I mean, a feminist, equality it's a particular political statement, totally true in a world where there's not that. So then, but if you've been through that yourself and internalized it, so I'd say I'm a Buddhist, Catholic, communist, feminist. You understand? I mean, you internalize those parts of yourself. As you progress, you take on board. But the one that's, I suppose, the label you can see that's most evident to me is the Buddhist one. But I mean, it can't contradict. If it's validity, if it's truth, it can't contradict. If it's not truth, then.
I like that you've said that before, that Buddhism can facilitate us to be actually more of ourselves, not...
It has to be. If it's valid, it has to be this. I remember recently an interview with an American woman for her website. She wrote a book about women teachers or something, Buddhist teachers. And I told her being a rat, and she kept saying, well, why aren't you still a radical feminist? I said, I am radical, but I'm trying to be a radical Buddhist. And what's that? Well, a person who's radically working on their mind, giving up blaming others, giving up anger, giving up neuroses, giving up jealousy, learning to have compassion, forgiveness, these things. I mean, for me, radical is a great word, But it can't contradict. If it's something fundamentally related to ethics and morality, then it can only be incorporated. It can't be contradiction. I
wanted to ask you about a question about social media, because often it's talked a bit about and blamed for giving us a false sense of connectivity with others, but actually it's making our lived realities more disconnected. However, I had an experience when I was 25 where I fractured my pelvis and I couldn't walk for a year. And it was quite a depressing, isolating experience for me.
I bet, yeah.
But I can say literally, actually, Facebook saved my life.
I understand.
That sounds really cheesy, but I could connect with people through that. So I think that it's all about how you use it, and I'd like to know what you think.
It's clear what you're saying.
Yeah.
It's clear. All tools can be brilliant. All tools, all technology can be marvelous, but as soon as you create something that's got the potential to be good, you can also it can be misused, can't it? Yeah. So, you can see how, if we look at our attachment and interestingly in Buddhist psychology, a much deeper, more primordial attachment that we have, which is very hard to see, is attachment to what other people think of us. Attachment to being approved of by others. It's so primordial, And in fact, I think much of our models of the mind in our culture actually would assert that as positive, see us as social beings, that we actually exist in reference to others, which is a marvelous idea. It can be empathy and compassion, but also it can be total neurosis. So I think something like social media, where there's just this default, any of us, look at us all, we're in this neediness to be heard by others. Why do you think we're lonely, You think of loneliness. You've got no one to share your thoughts with. But if your thoughts are so awful to be on your own without someone sharing them, why do you want to share them with somebody? If our thoughts aren't valid, on their own. This is the depth, I think, of this attachment, this neediness to be seen by others and heard by others and approved of by others. And again, the irony of this low self-esteem we have. So you can see that so-called social media, these terms we make up, can be an expression of this, just default vomit everything out and get someone to tick you and say yes, isn't it? I mean, it can be this, of course it can, but it can be a marvellous tool, of course it can.
Bob Brown gave a talk recently about optimism. And,
I know, my sister told me about it.
Yeah, and he said that during his darkest hours, he's saved by his friends, his family, and the raw beauty of nature.
For who?
The raw beauty of nature.
Oh, yeah, wonderful.
Yeah, it's quite poetic. But my question was, do you think that our suffering is amplified not just from the fact that we're disconnected from ourselves and then therefore disconnected from other people, but also from our environment?
You mean the flowers and things?
Yeah, nature.
Isn't the building an environment as well?
Well, it's different to...
I know, okay, I think, okay, of course you're right. But I think there's a danger there, you know. I think there's a danger in this. And it's not what he meant. You are right, I agree, but it brought up for me another point. That we go, oh, how disgusting cities and freeways, and oh, cars, and I want to go see the trees, you know. But actually, I think, well, who lives in buildings? Who's driving cars? Human beings like you and me sitting there at the wheel, worrying about their constipation, freaking out because their wife didn't love them and wanting to kill themselves. So if we have real empathy with beings, we'll be happy to be in big cities of 5 million plus people, because that's where people need us, trees don't. That's another point, but I agree your point, but I think we can easily have this aversion to big cities and buildings and cars, but it's very arrogant, I think. The great bodhisattvas, they want to be where all the maniacs are, you know. You go up to the mountains and get realizations, then you come down to where all the crazies are, because they're the ones who need us. But your point is true also, I'd say. When you're caught up in yourself, you can't see past your own nose.
Extend to being a bit disconnected from our physical bodies as well?
Well, everybody's got their own trip, isn't it? Just attachment and fears we've all got our own ways of expressing it, isn't it? Of course it's true.
I've got a lot of questions.
And then we'll... like this. I'm so sorry.
No, it's fine.
Elevated yourself.
I was wondering if you think that there's an essential difference between people. Some people seem to have the capacity to overcome their emotional states.
I understand, it's a good point.
And other people don't.
It's a good point.
Is it about resilience?
You know, I'd put it, using again the Buddhist model of having these negative and positive states, okay? Forget the neutral, there's very particular states of mind, but forget those. The key ones we're concerned with are these so-called negative and positive, okay? So the negative ones for the Buddha, the ego grasping, the attachment, the anger, the fears, the jealousy, they are in their nature the cause of our suffering and our isolation from others, you know? And the positive ones, by definition, are the source of our happiness and our connection with others. So many times I'll do courses and things, this is what my job is at the moment, and somebody will be in the class, like a mother, and she'll be in tears, like, what am I going to do about my daughter? She's 15, she throws chairs at me, you know, she doesn't do anything I say, I'm completely terrified that she's going to be insane, what'll I do? The first question I ask is, what are her good qualities? And if she says she's kind, she's loving, she speaks the truth, she's moral, I say, don't worry about it. She just, you know, she'll be okay. So in other words, my way of putting it is, some people, tragically, okay, Buddha would say every living being necessarily has this potential to change. Dogs, ants, any sentient being has it by definition, but we can't always access it. Yeah. So how fortunate we can be born on this earth and have access to kindness and forgiveness and clarity and morality, that part of ourself, which you don't get from your mummy, but you bring with you. So it's true, some people, their psychoses are so intense, their suffering is so bad, these poor old pedophile priests, which we love to hate, all these crazy kids are running around America killing people, you know, totally unhappy, insane, mentally ill human beings. It's like you basically can say they can't access their virtue, they can't access the goodness, the kindness. Their minds are overrun by the neuroses. And that's for sure, it's tragic. But the goodness is there, but can't be accessed, you know. I mean, I use an analogy a lot from my own mind, which I find quite helpful, that I've got all these roommates, you know. So I've got all the crazy roommates, the anger, the jealousy, the attachment, the low self-esteem, the misery, the depression, the arrogance, the pride. And they run the house mostly, you know. And there's 47 variations of every one. And you've got love and kindness and wisdom, but they're hiding under the beds and they're scared to come out. So being your own therapist, knowing your own mind, speaking simply, is you get more and more clear in listening to these endless thoughts that are constantly running from the second we wake up. So the skill from doing these meditation techniques and from using Buddha's model is that you get better and better and better at hearing all the thoughts and being very precise in identifying what thoughts they are, either the crazy roommates or the virtuous roommates. And basically being your own therapist means you're doing cognitive therapy. Your virtuous thoughts are arguing with your non-virtuous, the rubbish thoughts, you know. But usually the rubbish ones run the show. You completely fall into depression and 6 weeks later you know what's going on because we've just run completely with those and you don't pay attention to the other ones. So we have to let the good roommates come out, you know, have courage, come on out.
Do you think that there's a problem with the categorisation of emotions, that we assume that depression or feeling low or anxious is necessarily a bad state of being when we...
No, I think the problem is not that anxiety and depression cause suffering, because they either do or they don't. The problem is then another roommate comes out and starts criticising yourself for having them. So it's bad enough being depressed, but then we get angry with ourselves for being depressed. Bad enough you get angry, then another angry voice comes out and starts criticising. So we have to have the courage to own. Like if you're playing the piano and you play the wrong note, you don't go kill yourself because you played the wrong note. But you've got to recognise you played the wrong note and have enough courage to go, I can change it. Yes. So with your own mind the same. We've got to be realistic and recognising, and the Buddhist psychology is very distinct in understanding these different states. So they've got different characteristics. You've got to be precise. Attachment is a neurotic external exaggeration of the delusions of something. It's a neurosis. You've got to see it's that, but then don't buy into it and don't define yourself as it, and know that you can change it.
So I was having a conversation with a Christian friend, and he told me that he thinks that the problem with Buddhism is that it lacks the concept of faith, because
what's faith? What does he say?
Well, in his view, he thinks that Jesus has already saved us, so we just have to have faith in that.
Okay.
Whereas I think that Buddhists do have faith, but we have faith in ourselves. What do you?
Well, I mean, it's perfectly fine. It's a view. Christianity is a worldview. All power to people who want to have that view. I have no complaint. If he wants to have faith in Jesus, fantastic, Nothing wrong with it.
But we have faith too.
Well, faith, also you'd say a Buddhist has faith. So let's look at the word faith. Look at the word confidence. Confide, with faith, with trust. So the trouble is, I think we've put this meaning onto the word faith, coming indeed from the creative religions. That, a really good Muslim or Christian would have total faith, blind faith in the Creator. That's the best one. 90% of them don't do it. If there is a being who did create the universe, who did create the laws of morality, you'd back off, please, and accept whatever God does. That's absolutely true. But that's not the view here. But it doesn't mean you don't have confidence and faith. Yes, I mean, if you're studying acupuncture, but you've never heard of it before, but you begin to study, you've got to have real faith in your teacher. They're not leading you up a garden path.
Yeah.
But your faith is based on your wisdom, on your own you've got to use your noggin and check it up and recognise and take it on board as something valid, not because the person's got a cute nose, but you've checked up and acupuncture seems valid. Then you can have faith in your teacher, because if you don't, you won't learn a single bit about acupuncture. But it comes along with wisdom, hand in hand, I'd say. We have it wrong. I think we have different definitions of faith.
Yeah.
He assumes blind faith.
Yes.
And this is not the view here. It's based on intelligence, your own experience.
Do you think that we can value intelligence too much over wisdom?
Well, you have to define your terms first. Don't mystify wisdom either.
Well, for example, if we live within academic institutions and we feel like we have to perform to get to here, to get to there.
I understand, that's okay, nothing wrong. But it's like the difference between wisdom and intelligence is if you forget that knowing the recipe doesn't mean you cook. If you think knowing the recipe means you're a cook, you're in big trouble, isn't it? You've got to put your money where your mouth is and go make the cake. You can have a head full of recipes but not know how to make a cake. Well, that's not wisdom, that's just intelligence.
You've got to do it.
It's got to be experiential. It's got to be applied and actually experienced within you. There's this lovely word in Tibetan, the Dalai Lama's name, Tenzin, knowledge holder. A person who's, an actual musician is a knowledge holder, not just intellectual. An actual cook, a person who's got wisdom, it means internal, experiential knowledge, not just intellectual knowledge. But it starts with the intellectual.
So there's been a bit of discussion lately in the media about the way that suicide is talked about. And I think that it's still a largely taboo and misunderstood subject. Do you think that it's because we're a bit in denial of our own mortality? And also, do you think it's right to say that Buddhism teaches us that in order to be fully living, we have to know and accept that we're already dying?
Oh, your clever questions, Dana. Look, I can't answer the first bit about suicide. I've got no idea, But the second bit, Buddha's deal, like I said, one doorway into the whole Buddhist approach, it is a view of the universe. It's a view of how the universe works, what a person is, what is happiness, what is love, what is suffering, what is this, what is that, what are the causes. So it's the wisdom approach. So the Buddhist approach is living in denial of reality is delusion. So if we live in denial of something called death, if it's truth, death is truth, if we live in denial of it, then we're delusional. That's what fear brings. That's what brings fear. So if it's true, then get in touch with it, please. And if impermanence and death are true, then please get in touch with it. It's not some philosophical statement. Buddha doesn't own impermanence and death. He just observed it. And because he sees that we've got all these delusions in the mind that live in denial of truth. Delusions live in denial of truth, basically. That's what they do. And that's what causes fear.
Western culture broadly speaking, we're taught to believe that you only live once.
Yes, of course. That's our statement, isn't it?
Now, coming from that mindset, when you first hear about Buddha's program of eliminating greed, hatred and delusion, you might think that's something that you could achieve in this life.
I understand, right.
How important do you think the idea of rebirth in multiple lifetimes is in conceptualizing Buddha's program?
Okay. Again, repeating the point I just made, Buddha's findings from his own experience are that reincarnation is true. It's not a belief system. It's true. So for me as a person who can't see that yet, because I haven't accessed the subtler levels of my mind, the Buddha would say, this is from the Hindus, that when you've accessed the subtler level of your conscious being, which doesn't depend upon the brain, doesn't depend upon conceptuality and the sensory, which therefore has the capacity to cognize phenomena that do exist, that the grosser mind can't cognize, which would include past and future lives. Then we can prove it to be true. But until I get to that point, I'm taking it as my working hypothesis. So from the big picture point of view in Buddhism, and I'm taking on board the big picture, one doesn't need to, we're the boss here, we can take on 1% of Buddhism if we want. Buddha says it's true. So I'm happy to take that on board, and I apply that and I use that as my basis for interpreting things, you know. But another person might not like to think about that, that's their call. That's okay, you don't need to.
That is that the rich, full, meaningful life includes both positive and negative emotions.
Well, that's all the Western views say that. Every single one, and why wouldn't we? Because we assume Robina got made in her mother's womb by daddy and mummy hopping into bed together. We assume that. So we see mummy and daddy have got delusions, so naturally they're going to produce another deluded person. So all of our models of the mind can only assume that delusions are normal. You know, we give equal status to all these, and I don't know any model of the mind in the West that would posit anything remotely like what Buddha's saying.
But can you really have happiness all the time without having pain and
But that's a typical view we have, and it fits very nice poetic, isn't it? Very poetic view. You've got to have the suffering to appreciate the happiness. I mean, that implies for you to appreciate my kindness, what you're suggesting is I should punch you first. I don't think so.
But I think I'd appreciate it more if someone else had punched me in the past.
Well, you know, it's true. So it's a relative. Okay, the way we talk about it is relative. It's true. But the Buddhist approach is it's not a relative thing. You know, states of mind that are virtuous are also states of mind that are in sync with reality. They are realistic states of mind, and that's a very abstract concept to us. We don't talk like this at all, you know. And then the way we talk about emotions, delusions, you know, attachment. I mean, we romanticize attachment. Even when we hear Buddha's view about being free of attachment, we can't even conceptualize it. It seems so bizarre, you know. So it really does take some listening and thinking and trying to understand how theoretically it's possible. Where? Yes?
I wonder what you mean by truth.
Good question. Well, the Buddha talks about conventional truth and ultimate truth, you know. Basically, the way Buddha's saying is this, okay. In Buddhist philosophy, when you study it in more depth, you learn there are various synonyms for that which exists, for phenomena. The term phenomenon, object of knowledge, established base. There's several existent, there are several nouns, terms used to refer to that which exists. And this is crucial for the Buddha because mind in Buddhism is absolutely, we're not talking the brain, okay? Mind is the capacity for cognition. And the Buddha's point is that mind has the potential to cognize that which exists. In fact, the definition of an existent is that which can be cognized by mind. So Buddha's saying that mind that's fully developed, that's rid of all the neuroses, rid of all the adventitious delusional states of mind that are not in sync with reality, that cause pain and suffering, are in the nature of fear, when the mind is fully developed, your consciousness, and this is where it sounds insane, your consciousness, which is not physical, is no longer encumbered by all the rubbish, is necessarily pervading the universe, and necessarily can cognize that which exists. And finally, from the point of view of reality, when it comes to the subtlest understanding of this, the Buddha's saying everything is made by mind. And it just sounds absurd to say it out of context here, but everything comes from mind. The subtlest way of understanding ultimate reality for the Buddha is that there's nothing from the side of any phenomenon that exists independently of a mind cognizing it. And not even in the way that words would convey in our materialist view. It's a different way altogether. So mind is absolutely central. And that's why for the Buddha, there's no concept of an external thing called a creator. Superior being, Buddha uses that term. In fact, the definition, the Merriam-Webster definition of God is the definition of a Buddha. Omniscient, all-knowing, all-seeing, all-compassionate. Infinite consciousness that pervades the universe, that is in sync with that which exists, with no fear and no delusions. Buddha says that is the capacity of every single mind. So when that mind is then in sync with reality. So even that sounds abstract. What do you mean reality? Still, I haven't answered the question. It's been intellectual, you know. But this is how Buddha's saying. So he says the delusions cause us to not see things as they really exist, which is that they are empty of existing independently of various factors, and particularly empty of existing independently of the mind cognizing it. I mean, this is the theory of the words, you know. Yeah.
I think it's quite unfortunate that neurosis has become a profitable market in the West.
Is it? What do you mean?
Well, let's look at the
Who makes the money out of it?
pharmaceutical.
Oh, them. Oh, those people. Yeah,
and then we have
I agree with you.
marketing campaigns that say
Terrible,
if you buy this, you will get happy and so forth.
Terrible. Yeah. I think it's got to be, if you're going to do anything, I mean, the fundamental view, look, you mentioned Buddhism is based in ethics. It's got the wisdom side, the ethical side, and they come together. If it's ethical, it seems to me the definition of ethics has to be that it doesn't, minimal level doesn't harm another, and big level benefits another. So to be a vegan because maybe you make yourself healthy, that's not ethics. So that's just called self-centered. It's okay, but if you say it's ethics, that's great. Go for it.
Okay.
I would agree with you.
Self-awareness. So fighting delusions.
Meaning for you, self-awareness means how would you define that?
Waking up from the dream.
That's a nice thing. Be more practical, can you?
Okay, so...
What does it mean in daily life for you? How would you play it out in daily life? Let's say I come along and shout at you on the road. How would your being aware, self-aware play out for you?
For me personally, it's not, it's trying to break the habits of shouting back.
Okay, good. No, I understand. We're on the same page. Looking at your mind, taking responsibility. Okay? Recognising what's going on in your own head. Yes, it's true. But don't you need a basis for questioning? Don't you need a basis for answers? Like if you're playing the piano and you don't know any music, you can't question what you're playing because you have no basis for answers. Don't you need a basis for your answers? What's the basis for questioning? To come up with an answer, what's your basis? You see my point? Okay. If you're learning mathematics and you say, I have to question my views of maths, you'd have to, that's referential, isn't it? You have to refer it to a basic principles of what maths is. Otherwise, if you say 3 and 3 is 7, if you don't have the knowledge that 3 and 3 is 6, how can you question it? So what's your basis for this questioning is what I'm saying.
You're saying that like rationality itself.
What's your basis? What's your principle? What are the principles you use to refer your questions to? I mean, I define what I thought ethics is based on Buddha's view. What's for you?
Well, I'd have to have a deep think about that.
Okay, good. All we need. Then your questioning of yourself will have a basis, is what I'm suggesting. It's not existing without depending on something.
Whether self exists or not.
Okay, well you need a basis to discover that, don't you? Where's all this thinking coming from?
From the self.
Rubbish. It's okay. Yes?
I was just wondering, how would you advise a beginner to start to try and reduce the delusions in their mind?
Oh, darling. Sweetheart. Oh, sweetheart. The first step has to be, well, maybe what goes on inside my head actually does play a role in my life. And then second, guess what? I can learn to look into it and understand it and change it. So then the next step has to be you finding methods to do that. So I'm discussing Buddhism here, but that's up to you. But the Buddhist one would be you basically have to, this is my point to him. You can't just look inside and start seeing there's something. You can kind of get a sense there's jealousy, you get a sense there's attachment. But if you don't have a really precise understanding based upon some model of what that is, you can't go very far. So I'm not saying you have to be a Buddhist, but you've got to use a method. Are you sort of seeing I don't think you see my point. If you want to go out and look at a garden, there's a big overgrown mess out there. You know it's a mess, but what's the first thing you have to do before you start putting your hands onto it? What would you first have to do? Learn botany. You're not communicating, are we? I'm sorry. I tend to think, and I've got a feeling you're suggesting, and forgive me here, that we tend to think there's something holy and special by looking inside. It's like looking at a garden, being very mindful, but not having a clue how you label what you're looking at. Are you hearing my point here? I want to play the piano. You sort of put your hands on the piano, hope Mozart will channel through you. I don't think you're going to get very far. And we tend to think of internal as this, sort of mystical and special. Wow, you know. No, what I mean is I'm using the Buddhist explanation of my mind as my botany to refer what I see to. That's what I'm sort of getting at. So you might not want to take on a big kind of, you know, maybe you want to make up your own. You're the boss, you're allowed to. But it seems to me, you know, you don't reinvent the wheel every time you want to do mathematics. You go back to the mathematicians and you take their models and then you can get more creative. So take a basis, find a basis, there's plenty in the world, and then you can start to investigate your mind according to that basis. So it might be that you want to become a Christian. Well, you use his view to look at your own mind. We can use our own. We can take on board lots of views. Are you sort of seeing my point? It's not just some isolated mystical thing that you do by looking into your mind that's special because it's in your mind. No, it's a load of rubbish sometimes. It scares the life out of us. We've got to have a way of understanding it. Are you sort of seeing what I'm saying? A bit. Yeah.
Is there a point, where does Buddha say we stop in unattaching ourselves from things?
I understand.
We have basic needs, like, for example, eating.
Of course, yes.
So, you know, we desire food, and we desire possibly also, you know, human connection. So how do we know where to stop?
I understand. The key to that is clearly defining what attachment is and distinguishing it from liking food, enjoying company, loving somebody. So there are reasonable, appropriate, quote unquote, virtuous states of mind that are more realistic, called, you know, in Australia we like our Vegemite. Well, the Tibetans like their yak cheese, you know, it's just culture. So you have to learn to distinguish, the Buddhist view would be, between liking something and attached to it, and this is extremely difficult. So if I'm in love with you, I will not be able to distinguish between attachment for you and love for you. But the proof of the pudding is that when you don't do what my attachment wants, I will get upset with you. But if love is running the show, then when you don't do what my attachment wants, I'll be able to work with it and forgive you. So we often don't even know it's attachment until it doesn't get what it wants. That's when the panic attack and the anger and the fear and the neurosis and the not fair poor me come. As long as you give me what my attachment wants, I'll just think it's called love. You see my point? It's really hard to see it. It's very ingrained and very instinctive. So to be, you know, eventually we can go beyond the need of food, but that's highly advanced. Meanwhile, given that you're going to, you know, enjoy your food, you learn to be, you know, aware of what it is, conscious, taking all the Buddhists, understanding what it is, seeing it as empty, do this, do that, offer it to others, blah, 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 lessening your neediness and greed for it. Meanwhile, enjoying it more. You know, this is the irony. When we give up the neediness, the grasping, but it's really hard to see because they're mixed with the good qualities. They don't come on their own. So, you know, as you get more... And also the other point is this. The word attachment often immediately implies detachment, which seems a little bit like, you know, kind of being like depressed. Not true. Actually, as you lessen attachment, you grow empathy and love. It's sort of like every time you take a bit of pollution out of the water, the purity of the water manifests more, doesn't it? And the purity of our mind for the Buddha is all the goodness. It's there all the time, but it's polluted by the neuroses. So as you lessen the neuroses, you don't necessarily become only detached, you become more aware, more conscious, you enjoy your Vegemite toast more. Not to see it as indifferent. It grows the goodness in you. It allows the goodness to manifest. Do you understand what I'm saying? Yeah. But the fact is, these neuroses, for the Buddha's point of view, go to incredibly subtle degrees. So don't hold your breath, you know. We've got to learn, sort of like living with these crazy roommates, and you subdue them and understand them and know that they're there, but you don't buy into them every single day. But eventually, when we realise emptiness and achieve our own nirvana, blah, 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 they will be gone then. So it takes time. But it's this real awareness, and this can only come, certainly in this view, the very distinct model of what the neuroses are and how they function, you know, in a very precise way. And to really do it precisely in the way Buddha's saying, you've got to know what his view of it is. Because what we're talking is quite a distinct model, you know. Do you understand? Yeah. Who is that person? Yes. Please, yes.
The end goal is to free what this whole talk is about, was to get rid of neuroses.
Yes.
And to be able to see things clearly.
Right.
Would that extend as well to all social relations as well?
Okay, so unfortunately I didn't mention the main point of even doing that is to get there's a nice analogy in Buddhism that a bird needs two wings, wisdom and compassion. We haven't even talked about compassion here. The wisdom wing is the first one, which is where I put myself together, sort out the mess of myself and get rid of my own rubbish. Now what that qualifies me to do actually is the compassion wing. That's the political wing. That's where you benefit others. That's what they call the bodhisattva. You know, you no longer need, you finish the job, you've achieved your own nirvana, you don't need to be reborn, you've finished, but you will only want to be reborn, only want to come back and back and back, only for the sake of others, to benefit others. So the final one is that. That's the point of all of this. We've only just talked about the wisdom wing, but the point of it is to be of benefit to others, to make the world a better place, to cease other people's suffering, to help others. That's the point of it, in the long term. That's what a Buddha is, a person who's got two wings. Does that make sense, in your terms, what I'm saying?
Yeah, I guess. I think that at the heart of what I'm thinking about was what you were talking about in response to the last question.
Yeah.
Where I would say the whole need for political and economic change probably comes from the fact that our main material needs are food, shelter,
yes.
Warmth,
right.
Water.
Yeah.
Half the world can't even get those things.
That's right.
Because of the social and economic system that we have in place.
Sure, totally.
Very institutionalized. Would you say that Buddhism allows for strong social change, or would Buddhism the change?
So you mean social change means people, isn't it? Human, yeah. The work. This is the point. That's what the compassion wing's about. Working in whatever way is appropriate in your culture at your time in history to be of benefit to others, to whatever way is appropriate. If you're living in a little country, like living 1,000 years ago in this country, you're doing the compassion wing, you'd be of benefit to others. If you're living in you're a multi-millionaire, you'd use it for others. It would be not anything to do with I, and it would encompass all of those. To be a benefit to others, because we all are intensely, philosophically Buddha says we're all interdependent, but emotionally we are too. So therefore, once you've done the wisdom wing, once you rid yourself of your own rubbish and your own neuroses, which separates you from others, you've achieved your own goal, your own bliss if you like, but now you're qualified, because we're all in the same boat. You're now qualified to help the universe, as long as it takes.
Maybe one more question?
Yeah, sure. What, darling?
I'm a designer.
Okay, you learn some skills with design?
Yeah.
On your computer? Okay. How do you know when you've done it right, sweetheart? How do I know if I've achieved grade 1? Or how do I know where I've achieved nirvana? The same answer applies. It's how do I know I played the right note? By looking at what Mozart says. So how do I know I've designed it right? Because I've followed the rules. How do I know I've achieved that internally? Because I've followed the rules. Because there's a set of rules there and a clear definition of what mind is, what this is, what that is, and I'm using that as my reference, to see. And so then you have to learn to know where you're at. If you don't know where you're at internally, you're in serious trouble.
So how do I know when the reality which I hold is...
By following Buddha's rules, by taking Buddha's model, the model he used to get his own results, the model that Bach used to get his results, the model that Einstein used to get his results, the model that Julia Child used to get her results, whatever the thing is that you're learning, you refer to that one and you say, oh good, tick that box, now I've got grade 1, now I've got grade 2, now I've got grade 3, now I've got graduation. You'd have to refer to, this is my point to him, my point over here. It's not some abstract, internal, mystical, wow, far out, amazing. It's a down-to-earth, grounded, reasonable set of, the Buddha would call this natural law, how he talks about natural law. You refer to that, and you know your own, if you don't know your own progress, you're in big trouble, that's what I'm saying. If you don't know your own progress, then you haven't achieved it. If you don't know you're at grade 1, you haven't achieved grade 1, because that's wisdom. So it's step by step, by following steps. It's not some mystical thing I'm talking. We're talking about Buddha, who found from his own way, and he's laid down those steps. And a person like me, a person who wants to choose, I've chosen to take on board his model, his philosophy, his psychology, his methodology as my working hypothesis. And that means I'm engaging it every day and checking my own progress as I go, according to that. You see what I'm saying? It's a referential thing. Are we communicating?
Yeah.
Good. She had a question. Yes, darling.
I just wanted to go back to what you were talking about in terms of meditation being a way of dealing with depression and anxiety.
I didn't say those words, but that's okay. Go on.
About examining your
Yes, examining your mind, examining your thoughts.
For people who do that, examine their own thoughts, but just keep finding the same kind of unwelcome
Yes, right.
how important is it, do you think, to have a teacher?
Oh, yeah, I think what I'm implying here is we do need, this is what I keep suggesting, that, we need a model of a set of tools. And usually we know There's no need to reinvent the wheel, you know. There's things that are there. People have accomplished music. You go to them. You don't say, I'm going to learn music from scratch. You go to, you find your own Mozart, and then you internalise, you become your own Mozart. So I think it's really obvious. I think anything we've ever learned on this earth, from the time we're born, we've learned it from someone else. We've learned it from a person who knows how to do it, haven't we? I think it's a really reasonable thing. We've got to use our intelligence, use our noggin, because and when it comes to spiritual stuff, we become idiots, you know. We think because I had a special dream yesterday, we're going to write a book about it. I mean, it's beyond embarrassing, you know. So we really, yes, I think it's very helpful, and that's why I'm saying over here, we've got to, I'm a Buddhist, okay? I'm using this model. Every one of you is the boss in your life. All these are out there. It's up to each one to find, and it's encouraging to find someone who's done it. Even if it's just one grade ahead of you, it's encouraging. It goes, oh wow, I can do that. It is really helpful to do that. I think it's really helpful to have a human being in front of you who is embodying, whether it's tennis or music or spiritual development, which is called a teacher. I think it's reasonable, it's logical, you know. But I suppose the point of emphasising the role of mind in the Buddhist perspective is because our materialist view doesn't even posit a thing that's not physical, you know. We say mind is the brain. So now, there's an amazing, wonderful book I read recently called The Undead. It's not about zombies. It's this American medical journalist. It's a very wonderful book. And it's all the contradictions that are coming up now because of all the farming of organs, of just exactly what is death, what is life, when is a person no longer a person, what is consciousness. And they're finding, because they've been keeping people alive, all warm and toasty, while they're dead, brain dead, you know, so they cut their organs out. They're finding people come back to life, you know, they've got the liver ready to cut out and the person comes alive again, and the mother says, no, you can't cut it out. All these contradictions, which I think is great. So one of these doctors, he said, I can say with certainty that consciousness is not a function of the brain. Haven't got a clue what it is, but I think it's great that these are happening, and these conversations with the Dalai Lama and all these scientists, you know. So it's just marvellous that there are these conversations now in the West, where we've been so determined before that the brain is all there was, you know. So the relationship is obvious, it's utterly interconnected. But when you have this, take the view that your mind, which is the thoughts, don't worry about the brain, then it brings a much more powerful awareness of what's happening, you know. And you can then learn to work on your thoughts. Like, for example, if we have very intense sexual attachment, it seems almost like a joke to say that that's mental, doesn't it? Everybody, especially you boys, you know it's physical. I mean, I'm joking now, but I'm not joking. You understand? All these, bits and pieces that do their things. It seems almost like a joke to say that attachment is mental, but literally attachment is a conceptual state of mind. But the way this Tantrayana model describes it, it's coursing through all our nervous system, this energy that triggers the wind energies that cause all the berserk things of the body, you know. But attachment is not physical, it's mental. That's a shock to hear that. From our model, we just think, you know, mostly we just think poor men can't help it, you know. I mean, you understand my point, you people? Getting my point or not? You're supposed to laugh, but you didn't, so you make me. You understand? It's not physical, it's mental. But it's so primordial in us, we can't notice that, you know. But actually, we can prove it's mental. You know, if I'm in love with Alistair, won't he look like the most, there he is, sorry. Won't he look like the most divine thing since sliced bread, isn't it? He will look beyond delicious, won't he? We all know that. But look 6 months later, how he looks to me now. I can't stand the sight of him. Well then, I don't have any delicious feelings any longer, do I? You see what I'm saying here? If it were physical only, no matter what he does to me, I still have the same physical response, but I don't. So when I've got attachment for him, he looks gorgeous, which is what attachment causes. And then it triggers all the delicious feelings. But when I have anger in my mind, it triggers terrible feelings, and he looks revolting, doesn't it? This is how they're literally delusional. So you can prove, that proves it's not physical. Are you seeing my point? There's something massively going on in the mind. And we're not talking here the brain, we're talking thoughts, conceptuality, thoughts, you know.
I hear a lot of people going, how do I get into this sort of stuff? And I want to hear the story about how you got into Buddhism and about what sort of characteristics you would ask, what sort of questions you'd ask people to ask about the systems they look at, and what sort of characteristics they'd have for a model, etc.
Just quickly, okay, I won't be long.
Question.
I won't be long. I think, without trying to sound all grand and noble, since I was a little girl, I always, when I first went to Mass, I announced to my mother I was going to be a priest. I found my life, I found my job in life. Of course I couldn't be a priest, I wasn't a boy, you know. So anyway, the point is, I think for me, I grew up in a family of 7 kids, Catholic. I mean, all my sisters never had these thoughts. I always had these thoughts about you know, wanting to understand the world, I suppose. So then for me, I went through these different stages and looked very different, but for me it was this constant progress of trying to find a way to frame the world, understand the world. I never went to the scientific approach, but I went through the political one. You're looking for reasons for why there was suffering, you know? And now here I am using the Buddhist one. So I'd say I always wanted, more than anything, I wanted happiness, but I wanted freedom more than anything. I don't want to sound grand and noble, but I wanted truth, and I'm using the Buddhist way. So for me, the one, because the Buddhist one is not about just blind belief, it's not about a creator, I strongly emphasise, whenever I have to talk to Westerners, which is all over the world, it's my job at the moment, so I've given up running the prison project, it's to use our heads, to use our noggin, to check up. We are the boss, not Buddha. We are the boss, not Buddha. So we have this terrible tendency, I think, when it comes to spiritual stuff, to lose our common sense. And I think it's just a load of garbage, you know? I mean, you look at all the Buddhist view, it's as cosmic as you'll ever find any view. But for me, the point that if it is true, it is knowable. So I'm prepared to take it as my hypothesis until I can prove it's wrong, which is surely the approach. And I say that consciously, and I mean it sincerely, you know. Then you're very much more grounded, you're not fanatic about it, you're not attached to it, you know. So you've got to use your head, use your intelligence. And we've all got different style, different approach, you know. Even amongst Buddhists, there's many different approaches. So realise that we're the boss. Use our intelligence, use our noggin. Don't be arrogant, but use our intelligence, you know, and then take it one step at a time. But I think the major point is know we all have potential, that thoughts are not set in stone. No matter how bad life is, no matter how severe the depression is, no matter how bad the anger, the suffering, the cancer, the jealousy is, we can change. We can change. It out there might not change. We can change. And a great example, I learned so much from people in prison, I tell you. Unbelievable. People living in these garbage dumps, especially in the States, on death row, innocent people. I mean, you're reading about it all the time, you know. So there's this one woman, I read about it, and meet her. She, like 30 years ago, hitching in Florida with a little hippie husband and hippie kids, and they get picked up by two blokes. The two blokes get stopped by the cops. They kill the cops, and they blame the hippies. So they were on death row. The husband was executed. I mean, you can even imagine the nightmare. She lost her kids. She's on death row for 17 years. And I read her biography, and she said, I couldn't change anything, but they couldn't take my mind from me. So I decided, I am not a prisoner, I am a monk. I am not in a cell, I'm in a cave. I mean, it sounds easy, cute words, but to have got to that point, I mean, talk about courage, unbelievable, to get to that point, which means she had some extraordinary confidence in her own capacity to change her own thoughts. And this is what I'm talking about. So, I mean, I find extreme examples very powerful, you know. And that, for me, is the main one to go away with. Whatever methods you people find, I don't care. But never give up on yourself. Know you have immense potential. Do not define yourself in terms of your shit. But don't deny your shit. Recognise it for what it is. But don't exaggerate it. Don't define yourself in terms of it. Don't make it worse than it is. But know you're not set in stone. You can change. And that, for me, is what I've got from this. I mean, learning from this. And to never give up, never give up, never give up. And we're all in the same boat, okay? Put yourself together, then you can help others. Because I mean, I can see this from my own political activity. I was very mean. I meant really well, out there shouting, yelling, demonstrating, getting arrested and all the rest. So noble, so idealistic. But I was a maniac, you know? You know, all exaggerating, wow, the world is changing. And I hear people say the same thing, and the world is changing. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. But you've got to have this attitude of never giving up, knowing if you work on yourself and you become more wise and more clear and more brave and more courageous and therefore more loving and more compassionate, then you will never give up. No matter how bad things get, you will never give up. And that has to be the one, you know, like Bob Brown with his optimism.
Yeah.
Well, my philosophy is, even if you're drowning, stay perky. Okay? We'll stop there.
Okay, well, on behalf of the Buddhist Studies Society, we just got a small gift
Oh, look at that. A cup for my coffee.
And yeah, we'll just give you a warm thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
No, that's fine. I understood that from
Yes.
No. And it's more important that everybody hear what
I hope so. Thank you. Thank you. What are you doing here?
I'm studying psychology. Yeah, thank you. I find it difficult to stuck in it's a very scientific approach. I enjoy it.